Hello, I'm Jessica Chopin-Roney, and I am the director of the program of Early American History. I've just lost my brain. I'm sorry. The program in Early American Economy and Society, and at the Library Company of Philadelphia. And it is my very great pleasure to welcome you to our fireside chat, our virtual fireside chat with Dr. Zara Anishanslin, who is joining us to talk about her new book, not even out yet, The Painter's Fire, there we go, A Forgotten History of the Artists Who Championed the American Revolution. So we are about to get into that. Before we do, I want to thank Grace Harrington, who has coordinated the fireside chat for us today, and to welcome you all virtually to the Library Company, which is what is behind me here in this uh, painting or this image by John Birch. And today, the American Philosophical Society has a library in this space that is a reconstruction, but originally it was the Library Company, and that is Benjamin Franklin's statue in the niche. So, which is appropriate because Franklin comes up a great deal in Zara's book. I want to remind you that we are in a time of really dire circumstances for many scholarly and academic institutions. And so if you are not a member of the Library Company, a shareholder, going back to Benjamin Franklin, you can buy a share in the Library Company. I urge you to check it out. I am a shareholder, a very proud shareholder, and it's one way of keeping the conversation going. The Library Company is on the cusp of 300 years. So, I also want to alert you to our next fireside chat in July. We will be reading, or discussing rather, Eran Zelnick's American Laughter, American Fury, Humor and the Making of a White Man's Democracy, 1750 to 1850. So we're going from, oh goodness, I can't show things. There we go. We'll be going from art to some humor, not really. It's a little, at any rate. Without further ado, let me introduce you to Zara Anishanslin. Zara is an associate professor of history and art history at the University of Delaware. She works on early America and the Atlantic world with a focus on material culture and public history. She previously taught at CUNY and at Columbia and was a postdoctoral fellow at my alma mater, Johns Hopkins University. Her award-winning first book, it's a wonderful book if you haven't had a chance to read it yet, Portrait of a Woman in Silk, Hidden Histories of the British Atlantic World, was published by Yale University Press in 2016. For the book that we're going to talk about today, she's had a number of prestigious fellowships, including she's been a Mount Vernon Georgian Papers Fellow at the Royal Archives at Windsor Castle, a Davis Center Fellow in Princeton History Department, a fellow at the American Antiquarian Society and the Massachusetts Historical Society, and a Mellon ACLS Scholars and Society Fellow with the Museum of the American Revolution. She has all kinds of really cool credits to her name. I will just highlight the one that many people will get most excited about, which is that she served as the material culture consult for Lin-Manuel Miranda's show, Hamilton the Exhibition. So that Hamilton is, I don't know if you saw the Tonys on Sunday, just celebrating its 10th anniversary. And they had a very cool reunion. She is also finally a very public-facing scholar, and so in addition to doing work like that with the Hamilton exhibition, she is also the creator and co-host of the podcast Thing for Things, the history podcast where things matter and stuff happens. So welcome, Zara. Oh, I'm sorry. I have left one of her important fellowships off, and it relates to the APS behind me. From 2023 until right about now, she was the fellow at the David Center for the American Revolution at the American Philosophical Society. So this is a very long list of accomplishments. As a side note, Zara and I both live in Philadelphia and share another connection, which is that we sing together in a show tunes choir. So we have lots of connections. So welcome, Zara.
Thank you, Jess. Yes, and I should say, in case people are curious, we're both sopranos, so There you have it.
or we try.
But we try, yes. We can hit that high G now. But I'm so delighted to be here, not least because I owe so much of the research funding and time to institutions that Benjamin Franklin founded. So so it's very fitting, as you mentioned, that you have him up there in his sconce at the former library company, now APS. So I would like to thank all the places that have funded me and this project, as well as Grace Harrington for the invitation and help with the organization. And last but not least, Jess, it's always so delightful to be in conversation with you about early American history writ large. And I could not imagine a better conversation partner to kick off this sneak peek into my soon to be launched book as I'm thinking of it. And then I'd be remiss if I didn't say everyone who joined us tonight in the webinar, thank you so much. I know your time is valuable, and I do not take it lightly that you're choosing to spend an hour of it with us. So
Yeah.
thanks.
Well, that's a great way to get started. And it's true, the number of institutions that Franklin founded that are still going in some form or fashion is truly staggering. Philadelphia is very shaped to this day by that legacy. But your book is also getting into how the legacy of some of these less famous people who were transatlantic patriots, people who were working on both sides in North America and in Europe, usually in England, but sometimes in France, um, who were advocating on behalf of the American Revolution and trying to shape a conversation around it. So let's start with a really sort of basic opening question, but what brought you to this topic? How did you sort of I can only imagine it unfolded in layers. How did you come to decide on the people who were in the book and what brought you to the questions? How did you get into this?
Yeah, a great question. So, as you know, and some people who are here tonight might know, I always like to say that I'm only an early Americanist because Atlantic World History exists. Because as an undergraduate history major at UNC Chapel Hill, since we're shouting out to alma maters, um, I focused on French history, and so when I got to graduate school and realized that there was this whole world of history that allowed you to look at multiple places on both sides of the Atlantic and to think of the Atlantic Ocean as a bridge, not a barrier between different continents and peoples, that to me was the most exciting thing in the world. And so that really is so almost everything I do has this Atlantic lens to it, this transatlantic lens to it. And also, I will say less seriously, you know, you end up going a lot to the places you're researching. So, you know, I love to go to London and Paris, etc. So there's a method behind the madness as well. But you know, so I was wanting to do something on the revolution that was transatlantic in focus, and I'm a material culture specialist, so I look at history through art and objects, things like architecture and paintings and clothing and spoons and chairs and, you know, our entire material world, which shapes us then as it did, shapes us now as it did then. And so I was thinking about how to zoom in on, you know, not just doing a broad-based all the material culture of the American Revolution on both sides of the Atlantic, because that's just a lot. And I was, those of us who are professors will understand what I'm saying when I say that oftentimes you get your good research ideas when you're trying to share history in accessible yet meaningful ways with your students, right? And you'll think, wait a minute, that's a real gap. And I wish someone had written a book about that, or I wish that I could assign them an article about that. And I was with a group of graduate students at the City University of New York, which is where I taught at the time, in 2015. And I think it's important to point that out because history does not cook fast in a lot of cases, especially when it involves, you know, traveling back and forth across the Atlantic to do research. And so 2015, I was with this group of graduate students, and we're in the American wing at the Met. And among the, you know, epic paintings of Washington crossing the Delaware and Washington and Lee by Trumbull, all the things that you're all probably seeing in your mind as soon as I say those words. There's this rather small, sort of unassuming looking, folksy looking portrait. And I went and looked at it because it was very intriguing. And I was like, I don't know who this artist is. And as I looked at it, it's by Prince Demah, who is the first identifiable enslaved portrait painter in North America. And as I read the little snippet that the Met had on his label, I was just blown away. Um, you know, because it talks about how while he was enslaved, his enslavers took him to London to train to become a portrait painter, which is an astounding statement in and of itself. Like if we'd ended there, it would still have been enough. But then it goes on to tell me that, he his enslavers were loyalists, and so they fled the Massachusetts home in which they were living when the revolution was kicking off and relocated. They were part of the loyalist diaspora that went back to England. He stayed, became a free man, and enlisted to fight for the patriots in the Massachusetts militia. So I was like, wow, this is, I mean, as a woman standing next to me said, this should be a movie. And I was like, absolutely. And I was like, or a book, this would be great. And so then, and I was really struck by the fact, and I'll show you this image later tonight, that the family whose portrait, the family of the portrait subject, William Duguid, who's a merchant, Scottish-born merchant living in Boston, the portrait's done in 1773. He's wearing a red garnet brooch shaped in like a heart. And that
Why don't you
brooch,
show us? Why don't you show
yeah,
us?
that brooch is also at the Met because the family loved this so much that they kept the brooch as well. So here you can see it. And so as I was standing there in the Met, and I was like, wow, this powerful material object that this family cherished enough to save. You have this signed, by the way, that's the back of the painting, which you can't see, on display at the Met, but they have a photo of it online that you can access. And then this is the painting itself, which I think is a really just fascinating, fascinating painting as well. And the books, do have titles, and it's just a lovely painting, and it's very arresting. And so I was like, wow, I do really want to do something on this. And one of my friends who's a historian was there with me, and he was like, this is your next book project. And I was like, yeah, because I can connect the London to it. And so once I did even more digging, the man he trained with in London was Robert Edgepine, who is an award-winning British painter connected to the highest levels of art and society, but also almost certainly of African descent himself, although he's passing for white at the time. And so, that also opened up a whole world. So that was the beginning. That was sort of the opening inspiration for the book, and then it took various twists and turns, which led me to involve Patience Wright, the American-born wax sculptor and spy. But so really, I said this with my first book too, so maybe I'm a one-trick pony in this sense, but I like to say that historians should visit museums for inspiration as well as archives,
Hmm.
because I myself find that the objects in museums can really spark a historical journey, just as reading an interesting letter can.
Well, I'm so glad to get to see this painting, and re viewers, if you pick up Zara's book, this is where it starts with this painting. And unfortunately, the only critique I have of the book is that it's all black and white pictures. You don't get to see the
Yeah.
color image. And that's just a cost. I'm sure the press, wanted the book to be affordable, and so that's why we don't have color plates for the images in it. But it is really cool to get to see it in, um, well, presumably close to what it looked like when Prince Demah actually created it, and the meaning of those colors and the vibrancy of the image.
I
So.
agree. Yeah, it is. And it's a wonderful little portrait in so many ways.
So So you start with Prince Demon. You start with that's where the book begins, and we follow him pretty closely for a lot of the book. But you also wove in other characters, and I say characters. It's reading this book in some ways is like reading a novel because it is about characters who, frankly, you couldn't. I just said it's like a novel. You couldn't make up what these people do. It's really surprising and extraordinary. And as someone who's been reading about the American Revolution for the last 25 years, I didn't know most of this. I had not heard of Patience Wright. I didn't know about Pine. I certainly didn't know about Prince Demah. There are some other better known figures in the book. Like Benjamin Franklin, who is one of the sort of nodes that the network that you discuss keeps coming back to. He keeps being a key player. And of course, Phyllis Wheatley in Boston. How did you come to connect them all up? Like, was it coming to Franklin? Was it sort of deciding, like, what was it that brought you, for example, from Prince Demah to a character, I say a character, a person, she's a real person, like Patience Wright?
Mhm. Yeah, and I think it's interesting, right, that all roads lead to Benjamin Franklin is one of the things we're seeing. But so obviously the Prince Demah and the Robert Edge Pine connection was very logical and something I wanted to pursue. But I wanted to make sure that the book was not just focused on central male characters, partly because women are always half of history, and yet they are not always included in the stories we tell about the past. And so I wanted to make a conscious decision to have at least one woman be one of these central characters or historical actors. And so Patience Wright, I realized, was in London at the same time as Robert Edge Pine. She arrived in London just about a year after Prince Demah left and finished his training with Robert Edge Pine. And so they're contemporaneous, right? They're in the same place at the same time. And and I realized that she is not just artistically connected to Robert Edge Pine. For example, the one surviving portrait of her that hangs at the National Portrait Gallery in DC is by Robert Edge Pine. And I've said before that if I could be a fly on the wall, I would have loved to have been in the room when that portrait was being painted and here with these two quirky, sort of outsized personalities who were both ardent American patriots living in England throughout the Revolutionary War had to say to each other. But I realized that their connection wasn't just artistic, it was also deeply personal. When Patience Wright's daughter Phoebe, who helped her in the wax museum that she opened in London, so was a skilled artist herself, married a British artist called John Hopner, who, among other things, was rumored to be the illegitimate son of George III, a persistent, although unproven rumor, but something Hopner himself never, stepped away from. For I think it helped his career. But when those two got married, they had two witnesses, and one of them was Robert Edge Pine's niece. So there are these family connections as well, and so I just thought this is my group, right? You have overlapping connections that are very organic and natural in this sense. But then when you widen their network, you have Benjamin Franklin, who is becomes good friends with Patience Wright. Patience Wright actually arrives in London with a letter of introduction from his sister, his favorite sister, Jane Meekum, who's the subject of Jill Lepore's wonderful book, Book of Ages. And so they have Patience Wright and Benjamin Franklin have a strong connection. Her daughter Phoebe it becomes good friends with Franklin's daughter, for example, as well. And then Prince Demah and Phyllis Wheatley, when Prince Demah goes back to Boston after training in London, he sets up shop and he operates out of a watchmaker's on King Street, basically essentially the same block where Phyllis Wheatley lives with the Wheatleys, her enslavers. So to think about the fact that there's these two brilliant African descended geniuses, as they were labeled at the time, who not only lived in Boston and had both been to London to work on their art, but lived in the same block essentially, is just mind blowing. And so to think of, and I think a really great example of the fact that um, these people are extraordinary, but they're not exceptional. And one of the points I wanted to make was that we need to stop thinking of extraordinary people of color, women, immigrants, people of mixed race as exceptional because they're extraordinary, but they're not unique. And I think, taking away that sort of um, that it makes us recognize that there are many such people who contributed to our national story and our colonial story. And so
Mhm.
that's the sort of genesis of how the network came together. But it also expands to include, famous people, other famous people like George and Martha Washington and Thomas Jefferson and John and Abigail Adams and,
Mhm.
all the very famous people of the Revolution. But what I like is shifting the focus to these sort of what would be seen as side characters at best by a lot of historical accounts, really gives you a more diverse and vibrant revolution that I think does more justice to what it was actually like.
So most people probably don't know who Patience Wright was. You told us she went to London in the 1770s, but why did she make this journey? What was she up to and what was she going to go do in London?
Yeah, so Patience Wright, can I just say, there are historical characters that you fall in love with, and I just love Patience Wright. She is, despite her terrible spelling, she is, such a fascinating character. So she grew up one of many, many sisters and one brother. in a Long Island based family that moved to New Jersey when she was small. And they were Quakers, but they were an odd variety of Quakers. They followed the dictates of 17th century thinker Thomas Tryon, who advocated for what were at the time wild ideas like vegetarianism. She said at one point that the reason she thought that she and her children all turned out to be so ingenious or so talented was because she had not eaten meat for, most of her young adult life, most of her childhood and young adult life. So a really interesting idea there about what eating meat does to your powers of artistic genius.
Mm.
But they did things like the sisters had to wear veils when they went on public and wear all white. And so she, like a lot of people raised in strict such backgrounds, rebelled when she was about 20. And she went to the big city of Philadelphia. And she was cousins with Robert Feek, the Long Island born portrait painter, who's actually one of the key historical characters in my first book. And he sort of showed her around, and she eventually ran out of money and essentially met and married this older Quaker gentleman, as she put it, who had really nothing to recommend him except his fortune. So not a love match. But so for a while, she just lives this traditional, mother wife existence in Bordenton, New Jersey. Then her husband dies in the 1760s, and her sister Rachel, who is making wax figures. So think Madame Tussauds. That's exactly what they're doing, but also bust forms, so smaller ones. Says, "Why don't you come to Philadelphia and we can make wax together, and that can be your career." So she takes her up on it, and this two sisters become a sensation. They travel their wax busts up and down the coast, and Patience decides to set up shop in New York. So in New York, her wax museum, one night, there's an unfortunate incident with a child, a curtain, and a candle. Wax, obviously, very flammable.
Mm.
Wax figures themselves are made to keep the wax pliable in the 18th century. They mixed it with turpentine, and then the figures themselves, usually it's just the hands and the face and the head that are wax, and the rest of it is a sort of wooden figure padded out with cardboard and cloth. So, wax, turpentine, cardboard, cloth, candle, not a good, not a good mix. So to recoup her losses, she has this daring idea. She's like, I'm going to go to London and open up a wax museum there. So that's how she ended up in London. And once there, partly because Benjamin Franklin decided to show her off because he thought that her work was fantastic. And she opened up this wax museum in Pall Mall, which is, the sort of center of um, social activity in London. And within a matter of months, she was modeling the heads of King George III and Queen Charlotte, and the great and good of England, political, aristocratic, social, were coming to visit her wax museum. And this is from those beginnings on Long Island to where she ended up is an amazing story for any time period, but particularly for a colonial North American woman in the 18th century. It's just wild.
Can you show us an example of what you're talking about with her?
Yes. So, not many. Oh, there's Phyllis Wheatley. We can get back to her in a bit if we'd like. Um, so on the right is the only surviving full body. So this is the size of a man example of her work that still exists today. And this is at Westminster Abbey in London. So you can go to see it if you are there and make your way to their gallery. And this is a figure of William Pitt, the Earl of Chatham. And so William Pitt, of course, the darling of many Americans, because he was seen probably erroneously as a champion of American interests. I mean, he was more pro-American than many British politicians, but I think he got some sort of outsized compliments from the Americans for his support. But so here he is in his the wax figure of his head and his hands, and the hand, it's so detailed you can actually see little hairs coming out of his hands.
Mm.
And he's wearing the robes that he wore in the House of Lords when he, after an impassioned speech, trying to, protest against the American War, the War for Independence, aka the American Revolution, he dramatically collapsed and died not long after. So here he is in the robes in which he died on the House of Lords. Um, and this is I think a great example of the type of art that Patience Wright was doing. And you can see why people would be drawn to this, because it's a very different experience being up close and personal to this realistic wax figure who's life-sized than to looking at him. For example, John Singleton Copley painted the scene of him dying in a famous painting. It's not it's not the same, sort of visceral reaction. And so on the left, what you see is a portrait of her that was published in a popular British magazine. So got wide circulation, meaning her image was well known. And she is modeling one of her wax heads. And this illustrates really one of her signature techniques, which she was kind of an impresario. She would I'm not sure she did this all the time, but she would do it for show sometimes. She would take the wax, put it under her skirts, and mold it while she was talking to the subject or to the person who was observing her. And then she would whip it out from under her skirts, fully formed, sort of replicating the act of giving birth. And so obviously this is a titillating and, somewhat dripping with sexual innuendo and scandal. But this was one of the things that made her famous. She wasn't sitting there sort of chiseling on on a piece of marble or, decorously kind of molding something. She was in this act of very feminine creation. And so, thinking about her work that doesn't survive is fascinating because one of the things that she wanted to do, that she hounded poor Thomas Jefferson in France about ad nauseum, was she wanted to get the money to go back to America once the war was done and create a gallery of wax figures of the important figures of the American Revolution that would have been in Independence Hall for perpetuity. And
Hmm.
how amazing would that be if we could go into Independence Hall and see wax figures of all of the, famous actors of the American Revolution. So that's a what if that is too bad it didn't happen, but
Yeah. Well, and you talk about how realistic these were and how sometimes they scared people. People Abigail Adams describes going into the gallery and seeing a man sitting there reading a newspaper. And after 10 minutes or so is finally has to be told it's not a man, it's a wax figure.
yes.
Uh, or another where Patience Wright gets in trouble because she's got a head and someone thinks that she has actually committed some horrible crime and is wandering through the streets with a decapitated head and they're about to arrest her. So
Yes.
she's
Yeah.
clearly very good at what she does artistically. Um, but she, like the other people that you chose to follow, including Phyllis Wheatley, who we went by quickly and I hope we can go back to, these are all people who um, made a choice. They're artists, and most of the people you talk about are visual artists in some way, where they're using painting or wax as the medium that they're using. Phyllis Wheatley, as I imagine everyone here knows, was a poet. And is the inspiration for the title, "The Painter's
Yes.
Fire," comes from her poetry. Um, and they all made a choice, like and one that you wouldn't necessarily guess that they would make. They could have made another choice. So what do you think it is that drew these people? So and the choice they make, they all are ardent, small r Republicans. They all advocate very strongly on behalf of the American Revolution in times and places where it might have been a better business sense to keep your mouth shut, or it might have been better just sense because you might be accused. You talk a lot in this book about the 1777 Treason Act and changes in British policy, and most of these people or many of these people are in England at the time. So they could have made another choice. They don't. What do you think? What do you think drew the subjects of your research to support the American Revolution at great personal risk?
Mhm. It's such a great question because as people who study the revolution will know, it actually made more sense if you were an enslaved American, usually to go to the British, right? I mean, Dunmore's proclamation is a perfect example of this, that you are being offered your freedom if you're enslaved by a rebel, as Dunmore would have called them, rather than patriot, and you could be given your freedom for going to fight for the British. So Prince Demah bucks this trend because he stays and fights for the Patriots, right? And so I think it's interesting to think about the choices, as you say, that these people are making. Phyllis Wheatley, very similarly, both Prince Demah and Phyllis Wheatley could have stayed in London easily enough. So they are both in London around the time of the landmark Somerset case that rules that an enslaved man who was taken to London and was being threatened with being sent abroad was he had this landmark case where, it was decided essentially that if an enslaved person was in England, they could petition for their freedom, right? And so this is something that they could easily, Phyllis Wheatley and Prince Demah both were in London, surrounded by, networks of people who thought they were geniuses and very impressed by their talent. And this, in fact, was something that Prince Demah's enslaver definitely worried about because he said that while he was in London, he didn't, he tried to keep him from speaking to anyone of his own color, as he put it, because he didn't want him getting ideas into his head. Of course, not realizing, rather ironically, that the Pines were of African descent themselves. But so, you know, it's sort of similar to Sally Hemings making the choice not to stay in Paris and to go back to Virginia with Thomas Jefferson, right? So these people make these decisions, and I think in the case of Phyllis Wheatley and Prince Demah, it is personal ties that bring them back. Personal ties to people who are important to them in Massachusetts. Prince Demah's mother, Daphne, who was stolen from Africa as a young girl, just like Phyllis Wheatley was still alive in Massachusetts, and I think he didn't want to leave her and be in London. But that still didn't mean that they needed to be patriots. So I think that in the case of Wheatley and Demah, I think that they're attached to the ideology. I think it's the promise of the natural rights ideals of that all men are created equal, that equality is a promise that we can reach for, that liberty is a promise that we can reach for and attain. And so I think they're true patriots in the sense of ideological attachment, and very pure patriots in that sense as well. And Robert Edge Pine was very much the same, as was Patience Wright. I mean, they're all very ideologically motivated. It's very clear from their letters and records that they leave behind. Um, because I think they believed that the American Revolution could bring about a better world order, not just in America, but in the world. And Patience Wright in particular says this. And so I think that it's important for us to remember that ideals do fire the American Revolution, and that these are creative people, and creative people are passionate, right? There's something that you want to express if you're a creative person. And so I think creative people make natural revolutionaries on one
Hmm.
level.
Well, it also strikes me that many of the people you're talking about were, because they were understood to be geniuses at the time, because they were seen to be extraordinary, although I take the importance of your argument that they were not. Um, can you hear me okay? It says
Hmm.
it's asking me to confirm that I'm speaking English.
I hear you, and I hear you speaking English.
Okay. Um, I lost my train of thought with that. That what was I saying? Um,
You were saying that even though they're extraordinary, but
that because they were famous, they were in the public eye.
yes.
They didn't have the anonymity that many others might have to say, well, let me see if the wind blows this way, or let me see if the wind blows that way. And they embraced it. I think that you're exactly right that maybe in part because they were creative, expressive people, but they were also so much in the public eye that it was very difficult, I think, for them to kind of blend. They really had to take a stand. And the people that you chose to follow really, they take it and they stick to it. They don't vacillate, they don't change. They are
Right.
all of them quite committed throughout. But I want to move on to Phyllis here because before too long I want to open up the conversation to others. There will be a chat function where you can submit questions to us and we'll be able to read them. So you can start asking questions if you like, and we will be turning it over to that before too long. But first, I wanted to get to this image of Phyllis Wheatley, which I have seen my whole life since childhood. It's a very famous image. It comes up, I think, in many history textbooks, if not all of them, sort of the survey textbook. This is a very classic image to include in it. And as a result, it has never once occurred to me to think about how it came to be, or
Mm-hmm.
how extraordinary, again, I'm using that word, it is that it exists at all. Like, it just seems like, of course, there's a picture of Phyllis Wheatley. Why wouldn't there be? But it is actually very strange to have a portrait in any book of the author, but particularly of a young girl who is also an enslaved Black woman. Um, so one of the really engaging, among many really engaging parts of your story is how this image came to be produced. And we don't know who the artist is, but you might have something to add to that conversation.
Yes, so I also love this image, and as you mentioned, this image is often associated with the poem that inspired the book's title, The Painter's Fire. So the poem is to SM, a young African, upon first seeing his work. I think is I might have slightly butchered the title, um, but there's a line in there that refers to the painter's and the poet's fire. And so the Painter's Fire seemed like a wonderful homage to these creative people, Phyllis Wheatley and Prince Demah and Patience Wright and Robert Edge Pine, and the work that they're doing to keep the creative spark of revolution going, right? And so that one reason that that poem is so famous is that a lot of people have assumed that it's rightly, I think, that it's addressed to Scipio Moorhead, who is an enslaved young man who lives in Boston. The Moorheads are well acquainted with the Wheatleys. Like there are a lot of reasons that they would have personally overlapped. And Sarah Moorhead, his enslaver, among other things, taught artistic practices. So he grew up in a household in which he would have had access to artistic practices. So people have assumed that he is the SM, that he is an artist, very talented, and that because she wrote that poem, he did the portrait. So none of his known work survives, which is not surprising. An enslaved young man's paintings. It's astounding, actually, that Prince Demah's paintings survive and that at least one of them has this signature. But this portrait was done for very, very calculated reasons because like Prince Demah, who had to go to London to study painting because his enslavers, Christian and Henry Barnes, asked John Singleton Copley, but he wouldn't train a black man, as he put it. Um, so he had to go to London to train. Phyllis Wheatley had to go to London to get her book of poems published because she could not raise enough money in Massachusetts to get it done. So both of these creative black geniuses had to go to London to get their art to reach fruition. So one of the calling cards for Phyllis Wheatley's book of poems was that um, there was supposed to be a portrait of her as a frontispiece. This is the first frontispiece of a black woman in any book that's published in, the early modern world. So this is a groundbreaking image for a lot of reasons. But so because of a trail of letters, it's pretty clear that the image was done in Boston and then it was taken to London and turned into an engraving. So painters and engravers are two different things in the 18th century, right? As now. And so people have assumed that this SM, Scipio Moorhead, did the painting, but I think that I don't think that it makes sense for the Wheatleys. Phyllis and Susanna Wheatley are both very careful about manufacturing Phyllis's image. And I think that why would they use a young, unknown enslaved artists, or would they use Prince Demah, who's just back from London, having trained on St. Martin's Lane, which is the epicenter of artistic, training in the British Empire? Um, why would they not use him instead? And so, I have this theory that it's Prince Demah who did the original painting upon which this engraving gets done in the 18th century. And one of the reasons I think it is if you look at another portrait he did of this is his enslaver, Christian Barnes. Um, and you can see that the treatment of the lace, etc., is very similar to that of Phyllis Wheatley. There are a lot of sort of commonalities there. And someone at one point said, I don't think he did it because he's not good enough to do this portrait. But
Oh,
if you've ever drawn or painted as I have, doing a profile is a lot easier than doing than doing a full on. So I think one reason this is a profile is it's easier to do, and the other is that it shows her in contemplation and writing, which is also a revolutionary thing to show a black woman at rest and leisure and intellectual creativity rather than labor for the time period. So, but that gets me to this portrait of his enslaver, which is probably a copy of a Copley. And it does, everyone is seeing there is a blemish on it, and the blemish tells a whole other story. Yes. So, Christian and Henry Barnes, among other things, this is one of my favorite chapters in the book. They have a horse tarred and feathered as a threatening measure against them. The only
They
instance,
don't do this. This is something that
no, this
happens
is
to them.
something that
Yeah.
happens to a horse, and a horse is tarred and feathered, and the placard hung around the horse's neck is a warning to Henry Barnes to stop importing British goods in defiance of Boston merchant boycotts because of the Townsend duties. That's a pretty threatening thing. And this is the only time, to my knowledge, a horse is tarred and feathered in the American Revolutionary era. What they also do is Christian Barnes is held up at gunpoint at their own house. And so it's just a terrifying time to be a loyalist in, Boston in the 1760s and 70s. And the Barneses flee. Finally, it gets to be too much for them. They flee. They end up in England as part of this loyalist diaspora. And their house gets commandeered by the Patriot government. And all of the all of the all the furnishings, all of the property is given over to General Henry Knox and his wife Lucy. But before the Knoxes take up residence, someone went in, one of the Patriot occupying forces, and stabbed a bayonet through Christian Barnes's heart. So it's this wonderful iconography, not dissimilar to the iconography of Americans pulling down the statue of George III after hearing the Declaration of Independence read in New York City, right? It's this idea that you do violence against things to represent symbolic violence against people that you can't get your hands on. And so I think this painting is so fabulous because it's by Prince Demah, but also, the bayonet through the heart is astounding, I think.
In a very brief time, I think you've given a real flavor of the book and a lot of the kind of insane episodes that come along that and again, this is why I say it reads like a novel. It reads like you're walking through a series of events with particular characters, with particular people. And it's unfolding. The American Revolution is unfolding in extraordinary ways around them. I'm sorry, now I've found the word extraordinary and I'm stuck. Um, but like they don't know what's going to happen next. They don't know for the world or for themselves. They don't know what's going to happen next. And so reading the book is really this unfolding from a very particular vantage point or a network of vantage points. Um, the events that are happening and along the way just bonkers things are happening one after the other, a horse
Perfect way.
a
Yes, bonker.
horse being tarred and feathered and Christian Barnes's portrait being stabbed. She herself, you talk a lot about her. I don't think we should go into it now, but she's a really fascinating, complicated character, person that you sometimes feel sympathy for and sometimes quite the reverse.
Mhm.
Um, or I did as a reader. I'll
Oh,
own it.
yeah, same here. Same here.
And
Mhm.
and then on and on and on. I mean, it just keeps going. There's so many stories we haven't gotten to. So again, like it's just a great read. I think what I'd like to do is there's a question in the queue, so I'm going to turn to that and then please populate with other questions as you have them. And if not, I will keep asking questions myself.
Excellent.
But this comes to us from Keith Mukowski, who asks, I know that many of them went abroad, but do you think they regarded themselves as creating a uniquely American vernacular?
Mm.
Or were they seeking to work in British or European styles that already existed? That's a great question.
It is a great question. And I think it's complicated in the sense that, and this gets to what you were just talking about, Jess, is that this is a very contingent time period in which it's not sure. um, there are fits and starts to the revolution, right? And someone like Patience Wright, for example, at one point thinks that what will happen is not American independence per se, but America will inspire all of the British Empire to sort of reform itself, right? And because I think that to people like, whether they're loyalists like Christian Barnes or patriots like Patience Wright or Prince Demah, um, they have to become, they think of themselves as part of the British Empire, right? And so I think that this severance is not quick. And so I think thinking about something like an American art form, I think both, I think Prince Demah, I think Phyllis Wheatley, I think Patience Wright were all consciously thinking of themselves as American practitioners. And this is easy for us to know in Phyllis Wheatley's case because she has words that record, her thoughts about America and American liberty, for example. Patience Wright similarly uses her wax figures to make points about after the Battle of Lexington and Concord, the news of it reaches England, for example. She adds wax figures, life-size wax figures of an indigenous man and his wife, indigenous American wife, to make the point that this is an America, a pro-American space, in much the same way that um, other revolutionaries use the image of indigenous people to represent America in political cartoons or the Boston Tea Party, et cetera. And so I think that there is this line where I think they're trying to figure out how to be American rather than part of the British Empire. But I think along the way, they do study the British artistic tradition. Um,
Yes, although if you go back to the Phyllis Wheatley image, I mean, one of the things that you say about it that is so fascinating, and you show elsewhere in the in your book, how Black people are portrayed in British and European iconography, and it's always in very particular
mhm.
uh, stylized and exotic ways, and involve usually certain symbols, and that's one of the things that's so interesting is that Demah picks up some of those he knows the language. Like if you use this, that's what it will be understood to mean. This is that. African people always have a pearl, and they have a kind of exotic.
Right?
Um, and the fact that Phyllis
Often a
Wheatley,
turban. Yeah.
this groundbreaking work, this transformative work of a young enslaved woman, Black woman, doesn't have a pearl. It doesn't have those exotic. She is dressed like a colonial woman, a respectable woman. She's actually kind of fashionably dressed, simply but nicely dressed. And that in some ways it's not moving away from the iconography or from the techniques, the way that you treat different matters like perspective and so on, but it's um, this one, and actually, if you want to show us as well the pine painting or image of Congress, like a
Yes.
really different kind of portrayal of um, people and a respect for the spaces and the people they're talking about that's quite different than maybe European sort of the most au courant European fashions.
Yeah, and I think that is such an important point, and I hadn't thought about the American element of Phyllis Wheatley's portrait so much, but you're correct that almost every European portrait of an enslaved Black woman or girl would have shown a pearl somewhere, maybe a turban. And that, of course, the pearl is to emphasize the contrast between the whiteness of the pearl and the darkness of the skin. And Phyllis Wheatley instead has this lovely, genteel black ribbon around her neck.
Mhm.
And black ribbons are almost always on white people's necks in portraits in the 18th century. So this is a very distinct statement in terms of setting her apart. And then if you look at the Robert Edge Pine portrait on the bottom, that's his version of Congress voting independence, and above is John Trumbull's famous Congress, the Declaration of Independence that everyone has seen on everything from currency to transferware to whatever. But if you look at the difference between, the top is sort of airbrushed, in a sense. Everyone's very, very decorous, especially after they've, spent all day locked up in Independence Hall in a hot July day, which anyone who spends time in Philadelphia knows it's not the best time of year. And, on the bottom, though, you have, these sort of, military elements on the walls and these swag curtains. And in Pine's version, what you have is actually a very faithful reproduction of the architectural interior of Independence Hall. So he is trying to faithfully document what's going on. And if you look at the figures, the person in the front is kind of hunched over. There's some bald heads. Everyone's not, people are slouchy. It's much more of a this is how the revolution was made. So in much the same way that Patience Wright's wax figures were creating this hyper realistic version. Um, it's not mythologized in the same way. It's not romanticized in the same way. And I think it's really intriguing that these were people. Robert Edge Pine, incidentally, had the first bona fide art museum in Philadelphia, in Independence Hall. And then Robert Morris built a bespoke home for him with a large gallery space, which dwarfed Charles Wilson Peele's art slash natural history museum that he was operating out of his home at the time. So, how different again would our memory of the revolution be if we had all of Robert Edge Pine's history paintings that weren't They also were destroyed in a fire, most of them. Ironically, in the same fire that destroyed a lot of Patience Wright's wax figures in a Boston museum, which is where they ended up in the 19th century.
Again, if I have a critique of your book, it does not end. I don't want it to end like that. I want to
You
see
know,
the images.
me too. Me too.
It's horrible. Like so many of the people that you've been describing and telling us about, their work all ends up in one place, which is amazing until that place catches fire.
Hmm.
All right, we have a couple more questions I would like to make sure that we get to. One is from Lily Milroy, who says, "Greetings from Maine."
Hello, Lily.
That is a better place to be in July.
Yes, it is.
Um, can't wait to read your new book. Given your amazing work on textiles, which for those of you who don't know, her first book gets deeply into this, did you investigate the smoking jacket worn by Do Good? We don't know. I don't know how to pronounce his name. I'm going to say Do Good. Is the floral design significant?
Okay, so nice to hear from you, Lily, and thank you for coming. And so, what's significant about this, I have not done a deep dive into the specifics of this textile itself, but what I love about this is he's wearing a dressing gown, or as they would have called it in the 18th century, a banyan. So this is what gentlemen of leisure or scientific figures in particular, Benjamin Franklin has a banyan portrait, would like to wear to show that they had enough leisure and intelligence to relax in their library and read, which obviously is the message he's trying to give between the damask, between the banyan and the books behind him in the desk and bookcase there. So but he's a merchant, right? So he's showing that even though he's a businessman, he has this leisure time and this intellectual side to him. So banyans, the word banyan itself has an East Asian um, etymology, and they often are associated with a sort of Oriental idea of culture, right? This sort of British and French adaptation and Dutch adaptation of what they want to pick and choose from India, for example, or and in this case, he is wearing what looks to be a chintz gown. So a gown that would have been made of fabric either designed and made in India itself and then imported into America by the East India Company, or something that would have been made um, by textile workers in England who copied Indian chintzes, and they weren't as good. But and those also got sent to the colonies. The colonies were the biggest market for East India chintzes
Hmm.
in the British Empire. And in fact, in addition to tea, the East India Company had sort of monopoly on shipping these textiles to the North American colonies. And North American colonial consumers consumed more East India Company chintz than any other part of the British Empire, including England. So it's this really fascinating story of, he's trying to show off his erudition, his intelligence. Again, this shows that Prince Demah understands these portrait conventions too. Um, because, like I said, Benjamin Franklin has himself put in this. Nicholas Boylston, who's a very wealthy merchant in Boston, has a Copley portrait wearing a damask banyan. But they're also showing we are cosmopolitan. Both Demah and Do-Good are showing we are cosmopolitan. We are part of this global world. And I think it's a really good time to point out that some of the most cosmopolitan people in the Atlantic world in this point in time were people of African descent, like Prince Demah, whose mother was from Africa, but he grew up in Massachusetts. Before he was a painter, he was a mariner, so he traveled all around. So this portrait shows so much cosmopolitan global trade, and using these symbols of textiles, among other things, to make a lot of points with one visual statement.
Hmm. It's making me think I should get myself a banyan and go hang out in the library company.
You
Uh,
should.
I think that maybe that's how.
Franklin's was blue damask if you want to try to be like Franklin.
There you go. You were talking about etymology just here. We have a question from Fred Moore. Is Demah an African name? And you actually do talk about this quite a bit in the book.
Yes, so we think so. As with so many things with enslaved people, the records are just not the same as they are for white people living at the same time. But the reason that I think it is a West African name is um, Daphne, his mother, who, as I mentioned, was born in Africa. When she has the two of them baptized, she and Prince get baptized at the same time. She's very careful to call him Prince Demah. And when he gets his freedom, when his loyalist enslavers leave America and he self-emancipates. He enlists in the Massachusetts militia as Prince Demah. And when he writes his
No
will,
more barns.
yeah, no more barns. And when he writes his will, he leaves everything that he has to his mother, Daphne Demah. So she has also dropped the barns, which leads me to believe that Demah sometimes it is a surname in some parts of Africa. It also is a girl's first name in some Muslim African traditions. And so whether it was Daphne's given name from her African family that she then held onto and made into their last name, or whether it was her last name, I don't know. But scholars, historians of Africa who have heard me talk about this have been like, yes, that's we think that is a an African name that's been retained. And I also think it's really cool that that she chose to name him Prince because it's kind of asserting this pride in the Demah name when it's attached to Prince. So I think there's a lot of significance in his name.
There's only so much you can tell us about Daphne because of the way the records, the archive that we all know about. And yet she jumps out quite a bit. She's another one who, when readers pick up the book and read it, she's a through line throughout the entire book. You'll find her in the epilogue, and she's another one who's a real character. I think she and Patience Wright would have been sort of elbowing each other if they'd ever met.
They would.
Um,
I think they
they
both
were some
gossip too. So
feisty ladies who were not going to back down
yeah.
on what they thought or what they wanted to see happen, and were pretty good within incredible constraints, pretty
Mhm.
good at getting what they wanted. So we're right at 8, but I just want to close by mentioning, as you know better than anyone, that a lot of the people you talk about all died sort of in an untimely way and young. Demah and Wheatley, Wright, even although she does live a long life, but she dies unexpectedly. Pine, like all of them die sort of before they might have fully accomplished some of the things that they had set out to do. Wheatley's second volume of poetry, the rest of Pine's historical paintings, and on and on. Um, and so, I mean, sort of to wrap it up, like, why does it matter that we go back to the corpus of these artists, these patriots who again, at great personal risk, were deeply involved in the American Revolution? Like, why, despite all of the challenges of trying to recreate their stories, why does it matter so much to bring them back? Like, why in a filled moment of American Revolution stuff, like what does it bring to us to have to put these folks at the center of the story?
Yeah, and I mean, I think your excellent question makes me think of, Hamilton the musical and the ending bit about who lives, who dies, who tells your story, right? And if you die without heirs to carry on, or if you die too young, or if you die and then your work gets destroyed, who tells your story and how, right? And so I think it's important to recognize that art and material culture suffer from the same silences and violences in the archive that we identify with documents, and that what you see in museums is only a portion, and not even always not even always the one most reflective of the time period itself in interesting ways. And I think it's important to zoom in on these people and their stories, because I think that there is a danger right now, especially, of whitewashing the American Revolutionary era. And I mean that in a literal and a figurative sense,
Hmm.
focusing in on the very important, they're in my book too: George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, all the people that, everyone knows. And
Daniel Boone. I mean,
Daniel
it's like,
Boone even
so it's
makes
a
a
large.
side appearance. Exactly, exactly. So, and those people will always be important. And no one, I'm not saying that they're not, but what I'm saying is they lived in a world populated by enslaved people, people of mixed race, women, indigenous people, and to leave those people out of the story, I think does a disservice to the richness and the excitement of the time itself. And these three people in particular, Prince Demah as an enslaved man who self-emancipates and fights for the Patriots in addition to pursuing his art at great lengths. Patience Wright, who's a woman patriot, didn't even talk about the fact that she's a spy during the revolution in London. She's also agitating for prisoner of war benefits. There are thousands of Americans imprisoned in Britain under terrible conditions, during the war. She's working on their behalf. And Robert Edge Pine, a man so inflamed by the spirit of liberty that, he becomes persona non grata during the war for his art and then relocates to America where he wants to start this nationalist art museum. So, Black people, women, immigrants, these are the people whose stories are not always told in the standard narratives about the American Revolution. And so I think that who they are, as well as the fact that they have this, their art does present this idiosyncratic, radical, wild, bonkers revolution, that we don't think of necessarily as the iconic history or art of the American Revolution, is one of the reasons that I wanted to share their stories. Because, as you say, they were dedicated to the patriot cause, and I think it does a disservice to the vivid richness of the history of the Revolutionary era to leave these people out of the story. And their art is just, it's it's fascinating too.
Yeah. Well, you at the end, probably Patience Wright's sister is writing to see if they can get a burial plot to bring Patience Wright and bury her finally in the States. And really struck me. She said, "Well, why are we being so solicitous to help Tom Paine but not Patience Wright?" And
Yeah.
when you put them on that kind of level, it just really I don't know. The resonance of how important some of these people were and how well known they were. Phyllis Wheatley still is, but the others have not, maintained that level of their contemporary fame. Anyway, the work they did and the what they bring to the story to think about how they lived their lives and what it meant to be a patriot as an artist or in London, I think is a really important perspective, a really and certainly a fascinating.
Yeah. Well, thank you. It's been delightful to get to share some of their stories. Although, as you say, there are many bonkers ones we haven't gotten to. So
I know we didn't even get to the army. Um,
no, which is my favorite. Yes. Benjamin Franklin was offered an army, is all I'm gonna say, people. You can
Um, so I highly recommend the book. Because this is an advance, like before the book is going to come out in July of 2025. And so Harvard University Press has very generously given us a sneak peek preview code. So if you want to order the book now, you can get 20% off if you use, I guess, TPF20. Um, so that is a very cool thing, and I hope you will avail yourselves of it. And otherwise, please join me remotely from your wherever you are in thanking Zara for your wonderful book and for talking to us about it. It's really very exciting, and I hope everyone else will enjoy it as much as I did.
It was such a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you all for coming. It's really delightful to have a chance to talk with you about this.
All right. Well, until next time, thanks so much for joining us.